Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment. So, I've been reading, I read 40K books off and on. I really love 40K. Some books in 40K, if you're not familiar, or if you are, really struggle. And some of them are really, really good. And in the past, at least for me, the Dark Angels books have been particularly anything around Lionel Johnson, any of the Horus Heresy stuff. Not good. There are varying degrees of not good, but they're not good. And now books that he's just in, like with the Ruin Storm, are pretty good. It's not the character; they just, for whatever reason, just aren't haven't worked out. But when it comes to modern 40K, the modern part of the setting, the era Indomitus, I've been snapping up any book that has a Primarch in it, which is typically Robo de Gilman books, which have been really good. So when Lionel Johnson returned to the setting and came in this book, The Lion, Son of the Forest by Mike Brooks, I'm like, you know what, I'll risk it. So I picked it up and really enjoyed it. And I'm going to be as spoiler free as I can here. So I've not read any books by Mike Brooks in the past. I don't know what his other books are like. This one took some interesting things from a technical perspective that I haven't seen before. And I know that they've been done, but I haven't seen in a 40K book at the very least. So one of the things he does is there's 3 different main character perspectives. There's Lionel Johnson, and there's a Fallen, and there's another Fallen, and the 2 Fallen are on opposing sides. Okay, the Fallen that ends up joining the Lion is first person. The Lion is like third person limited, kind of an unusual third person limited, where it repeatedly refers to him as the Lion, and it says the Lion thinks, the Lion knows, the Lion, it describes it in that kind of way. So you're a little bit distant from the character without quite being in his head, but you still get his thoughts. So it's not like a third person perspective where you're not getting their thoughts, but you're also not intimately inside the character's head either. And then the third perspective is more of a traditional third person limited that you get in a huge majority of sci-fi novels. And so it's really interesting how he takes these 3 different characters and he gives you totally different points of view. So you're traditionally close to one character, you're very intimately close with another in first person, and then you're somewhat always a little bit distant from the Lion, which makes a lot of sense. He's a Primarch, he's Lionel Johnson. It's going to work that way. So, but it's interesting the way that he plays with these points of view, and the reasons he seems to do that. So, you have the one where it's like, here's first person point of view, so you get a lot of first hand understanding of the Fallen and why this character in particular, but why a lot of Fallen did what they did, how they've been acting since that time, how they feel very deeply once they see the Lion. Then you have the Lion where he's always a little bit off, a little bit distant, a little bit unreachable, but is also very interesting as a character. And then you have the more traditional perspective where this guy is also a Fallen, and you see his thoughts and you see his emotions on things without being deeply intimate like a first person perspective. And that's because you just want more of a traditional approach to this one character, because even though this character is quote unquote an antagonist, they're still very normal. They haven't embraced chaos. They haven't gone, full chaos worship or anything like that. They actually still hate chaos. their experiences kind of led them down this dark path. So you have these three different perspectives, and they're used to give the reader different experiences and different understandings, which I think is really interesting. And I think having that kind of approach with these three different perspectives in a 40K novel in particular, which are usually not very technical books, is really interesting. And it's an enjoyable read because you get those different experiences where you're like, okay, wow, this guy's thoughts are really interesting, or you get a little bit of distance from the lion and so on. From a plot and structure perspective, it's a pretty standard structure book, outside of the perspectives. And plot-wise, it's fun, but the interesting parts are really the lion himself, and how the lion responds to the modern 40K setting, and how the lion has changed from how the guy that he was during the Horus Heresy, and how he's responding to the Fallen, where it's not what you expect, and how he becomes, much like Gilliman, he's acknowledging mistakes. He's viewing what he's done in the past, not following down the path of like the Chaos Primarchs, of saying, well, the Chaos Primarchs are largely static. That they are still holding on to grudges. They're still very angry about really minor crap from 10,000 years ago, whereas Gilliman and Lionel Johnson have completely different approaches where they're actually evolving as people, which I think is really interesting. It's a very interesting part to read, and it's a very big chunk of the story, is how he deals with the modern setting, but also how he deals with himself. And that's a big component of the story, is how does Lionel Johnson deal with himself? How does he deal with mistakes that were made? How does he deal with what has happened since then? And how does he choose to respond to things now? And so that's very interesting. But the plot itself is like the most standard 40K novel plot you can have. It's really not that interesting. It's not boring, but it's not. I think they could have done more. It's fine. It's totally fine. It's fun to read, but it's pretty standard at the same time. And I think they really could have done more with it. Still perfectly serviceable for the book. It's not a bad thing. It's just, I didn't find myself reading it for the plot. I found myself reading it for Lionel Johnson and his personality and his approach to things, and his admitting mistakes and trying to take a different direction now that he was back. And also trying to handle the fact that, he's in the Imperium Nihilus. So if you don't know what that is, it's the dark half of the Imperium, where everything's way worse than the other half of the Imperium. So everything looks really horrible. And his approach to that is interesting, too. Character-wise, Lionel Johnson's very interesting. The Fallen that is in the first-person perspective. At times, he's very interesting. And at times, he's like exposition man. Where they're like, we need an exposition dump. Let's give it to this guy. Especially the first time you get his perspective. It's very, very heavy on exposition. And there's logical reasons for that choice, because this is the character you're closest to, and this is the character that you are understanding the feelings of the Fallen from in a lot of ways. And they have to cover some of this ground. They just do. But it's, especially the first time you get his perspective, is not that interesting the first time, because it's just like several pages. I don't know if it's several pages, because I did an audiobook format, but it's a while of like, here's what happened. Here's, have some exposition, you know. I think it could have been written better in that perspective. You still had to get the information across, but it really, information dumps can really slow books down, and this was no exception. It lightens up significantly as the book goes along. It's just early on, you're like, oh my goodness. So this is a guy that's gonna give me information dumps every time I get his perspective. But once it lightens up, once it backs off of that, you get a lot more interesting stuff from him, from an emotional and a really understanding of what it's like to have been a fallen. If you're not familiar with 40K, so the Dark Angels during the Civil War, that was the Horus Heresy. Lionel Johnson comes back to his homeworld at the end and finds that he's being attacked by his own people, and he reacts in a certain way. The planet gets destroyed, everybody gets scattered through time, and the people that were on the planet that were fighting against him become known as the Fallen. And a lot of them aren't Chaos Worshippers at all. A lot of them were just doing what they were told and didn't understand what was going on. And you get a lot of that from this guy. You get a lot of that understanding. Once you start to understand, oh, the Fallen aren't what we've been necessarily told. Because for a lot of the history of 40K, you're pretty much told the Imperium's perspective on the Fallen, which is, obviously these guys are traitors, and they're kind of mysterious. Some of them work for Chaos, some of them don't, but they're all traitors, blah, blah, blah. Then you find out most of them weren't. Most of them were like swept up in this situation, and it's a really interesting character to follow. It's just early on, and you're like, oh my god, stop dumping information on me. Action wise, the battles are good. Nothing super interesting, but good. You get some fleet stuff going on too. That's interesting, especially from a technical perspective. Really shows how a Primarch is able to do things that other people aren't in terms of organization and tactics. He's able to bring this hodgepodge fleet together and do way more with it than anybody else could outside of like Gilliman. It's a really interesting book, and it's fun, and you could probably, if you're not a 40K fan, you could probably pick it up and read it and be okay. There's a lot going on, but it's not like you need 10,000 years worth of backstory necessarily, and what you do need, they're going to give you in a lot of ways. But it wouldn't be the book that I'd say, oh, you're new to 40K, here, pick this book up and read it. I'd go a lot farther back from that. If you are a 40K fan, I think you'll enjoy it. And it won't be like, hey, this is the best 40K novel I've ever read. But it's enjoyable. And if you are a Dark Angel fan at all, if you're a Lionel Johnson fan at all, it's pretty much a must-read. Probably wouldn't rate it as high as, like, the Plague War novels and stuff like that. But it's a much smaller scale book. Just from technical perspectives, it's fine. Like I said, it's enjoyable. The cover art, which you can see here, is pretty nice. Yeah, it's enjoyable. I wouldn't rate it as the best book ever, and I wouldn't put it anywhere near the bottom. It's like middle of the road, and it's elevated a little higher than that simply because of what it's giving you on Lionel Johnson himself and the Fallen. But outside of that, just from a plot and story perspective, it's fine. The perspectives is different, and I think interesting, and I think it helps the book in some ways. Outside of that, though, yeah, it's enjoyable. I recommend it, especially, like I said, if you're a Lionel Johnson Dark Angels fan in 40K. If you're not a 40K fan, you haven't read anything in 40K, hold off on this one. You could enjoy it, but I'd get introduced to the setting first. And there's a lot of books that do a better job of that than this one.